In today's video, I'll be going over my recurve hunting setup for the season. I do have a couple of other bows that I've been shooting and have set up, but this is ultimately the one I have the most confidence in right now, and so it's the one that I'm going to at least start hunting with. I may switch to some of those other bows throughout the season. We'll just see how it goes. But this is what you would refer to as an ILF setup. It has a riser, but then that riser can be interchanged with a whole bunch of different kind of limbs, just depending on what you want to shoot, because it has a more or less standard attachment method. The riser is from Backwoods Composites. It's a 19-inch riser, aluminum, and it has a lot of mass, especially in the limb pocket areas. And then you have the ability to add additional mass weight to the riser as well. So I kind of have like a bare bow style weight attached here to help get me the right amount of balance when I'm at full draw especially. And then for the limbs on this bow, I actually had done quite a bit of my shooting throughout the summer with an inexpensive pair of Galaxy Silver Star limbs from Lancaster, and I actually shot those really well, more than I was expecting to. But then a guy that I had actually shot some 3D with over the summer decided that he'd be fine lending me a pair of his limbs because he was going to hunt with a different bow. The traditional community is pretty awesome in that regard. These are Uka Gobi limbs in 45 pounds at 19 inches. Limbs are based off of a certain poundage on a certain riser, and so if you change the riser length, you actually change the parameters of what the limbs will hit. But at my draw length, which is about 29.5 inches, where I have the limb bolt set, I'm actually pulling right around 45.5 pounds of full draw. Ultimately, that limb design does two things. One is that I do get a little bit more speed with a similar weight arrow and a similar tune. And then the other thing I notice is that while I'm at full draw and I'm expanding through that region of the draw curve, it's just a little bit flatter and a little bit smoother than the conventional limbs were. And those similar features can be actually exaggerated much further with a super curve style of limb. I haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet. That might be something I try out in the future. Now, one downside that I do have with this bow over some of my other ones is that it's not quite as quiet. But the flip side is that I'm substantially more accurate. Objectively, measurably, shooting both 3D and just dots, both more accurate for me because of the way that I'm able to shoot it, and it's also just more forgiving. If I have a bad shot, I'm not penalized near as much shooting this bow as I am on some of my other bows. And then for the bowstring, it's just a really basic 8125 18-strand bowstring, and I have cat whisker material, just a little bit of it, not a ton, tied in about 13 inches from where the string comes off of the limbs. And then I just have tied in knock sets, one above and below the knock to keep the knock from sliding up and down the string. And then I have an additional indicator tied below where I actually hold the string from. Holding the string down below the arrow is one method of getting your arrow up closer to your eye. And I've definitely found that for myself, if I'm able to get the arrow closer to my eye, whether it's from holding the string down below the arrow in a crawl, or if it's from a higher anchor point, I tend to shoot much more accurately with any aiming style, gap, instinctive, whatever. And then because I am holding the string a little bit further down, what I'm able to do with an ILF setup like this is actually loosen the tension on the lower limb just a little bit. And so I end up having a slightly negative tiller, about a 1/8 inch negative tiller, to be able to still get a good string feel, and then I just tune the bow accordingly. For my arrow rest, I'm shooting a springy rest. I just have a little bit of PTFE heat shrink on the spring itself. I had ordered that from McMaster Carr. For the advantages, it seems to, number one, have a little bit of cushion to it, which could add to the forgiveness factor. And it also, for an elevated rest, is a pretty durable option. I guess there are two downsides that I found to the springy rest. One is obviously it's not as bomb-proof as just shooting off the shelf. But number two, I found that you can't really independently adjust your vertical tension and your horizontal tension. So if you look at a competition shooting rig, like either from Olympic Recurve or Barebow, they have a rest that supports the arrow vertically, and then they can also adjust the plunger tension to add more or less cushion to the arrow, and that aids in allowing you to get a good tune and a forgiving tune. And with this bow, I found that I can use a 25-ounce springy rest with certain arrows and certain limb combinations, and it works just fine. I'm able to tune it. But when I switched to my hunting arrow setup and these little bit more powerful limbs than what I had been shooting, I just could not get rid of a knock high and weak reaction no matter what I did. And then I tried moving up to a 30-ounce spring, and I had a bullet hole in like 3 shots. So ultimately, once I got everything dialed in and all set up, it's doing just fine, but it was a little bit, I think, more limiting than what a true competition rest style would be. But again, the upside is that from a hunting perspective, obviously there's less moving parts, and that definitely has its own appeal. You probably also noticed that I'm shooting with a wrist sling. While it's definitely not a requirement, in fact, some of my other traditional bows like my Acadian Woods or my RK1, I don't have wrist slings on those. But there have been instances in where I've dropped those bows as well. Shooting at a 3D shoot or whatever, I'm really focused on the movement to get through the shot, and then the shot breaks and the bow blows through my fingers on my front hand and falls on the ground. And obviously I don't want that to happen in a hunting scenario, especially if I'm elevated hunting out of a tree. So the wrist sling is just good extra security there. Now for the arrow setup, I'll be hunting with this bow. This is about a 525 grain setup, which at my draw weight and my draw length ends up being around 11.7 grains per pound. Most traditional archers seem to fall in kind of the 9 to 12 grains per pound range. Some will go heavier, some will go lighter. If I'm shooting a 3D course with targets out to 30, 35, 40 yards, I'm absolutely more forgiving shooting a lighter arrow than this. But from a hunting standpoint, especially under 20 yards where most of my whitetail shots are going to be, I wanted to err on the side of a little bit heavier setup overall. Obviously the most critical thing is good arrow flight and good tune, and I'm able to get that with this setup. This is a full length 350 spine Black Eagle Rampage, 240 up front, and 3 of the trad vanes on the back fletched with a strong helical using the Arizona Mini Max jig.